Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 2023 Farm Bill discussion on rational commodity price and income support programs. To discuss these programs, we have a very distinguished panel, and my name is Eric Belasco. I will be serving as the moderator, and I am honored to introduce this panel and then allow them to speak on different aspects of price and income support programs. So welcome to this event. First, I'll start to my right. We have Dr. Joe Glauber, who is a senior research fellow at IFPRI, a visiting scholar at AEI, as well as the former USDA chief economist. And Dr. Glauber will be talking about general price and income support programs over time. Next, Dr. Barry Goodwin, who will talk about ARC and PLC today. He is a William Neal Reynolds Distinguished Professor at North Carolina State University and also serves as a visiting scholar at AEI. Next to him is Dr. Daniel Summer, who is the Frank H. Buck Jr. Distinguished Professor at University of California, Davis, and he will be talking about some of the dairy programs that are within Title I. Dr. Vincent Smith, who is our Director of Agricultural Policy Studies here at AEI, and he will be discussing, I'm sorry, what are you discussing, Vince?
Anything you want.
Yeah.
Infinity of the sugar price.
Oh, yeah. So Vince is talking about our most rational program, the sugar program. And then finally, as our discussant today, we have Dr. Norbert Wilson, who is a professor at Duke University, who is a professor of food economics and community. So with that, I will hand it over to our first speaker, Dr. Joe Glauber.
Great. Thanks so much, Eric. Let's see if this works. It does. Okay, so what I'm going to do is talk a little about, as Eric suggested, a historical overview on payments and other things. I want to talk a little about this wonky thing called the CBO baseline, and then with the little short remaining time afterwards, talk about what some of the implications are for we actually report these outlays to the WTO, and I'll just show you some trends there. But first, I think, about a month ago or so, we had this program on farm income here at AEI, and I think if you remember that the, net cash income down a little bit this year, but still at very, very high levels. But you can see that blue portion of the bar chart there is our government payments. And if you look at that over time, they've averaged about 4%, a little over 4% of gross cash income and about 16.3% of net cash income. These are direct government payments. I might add that excludes federal crop insurance payments. But again, there's this is the sector average. It's wide discrepancies. So commodities like fruits and vegetables, beef, cattle, hogs, very small portion of their income actually comes from government payments. You go to some of the row crops, cotton, wheat, corn, traditionally have been very large beneficiaries of these payments. And we'll see that in just a second. So if you just look, and this is the ERS calculation for direct government payments, you can see that those have declined. The direct price and income support payments have declined over time. So back in the early 2000s, large payments for things like the so-called price and revenue-based program payments, those have declined significantly, though, and you can see that over the last few years, what really dominates are these orange bar, or the yellowish bar there, that is ad hoc supplemental payments. And of course, those were in particular the trade aid payments that were paid to farmers in 2018, 19, 20, and then COVID payments. So if you look at projected Farm Bill payment spending, now we're going to turn to fiscal years. This is a different measure, but it's what the Congressional Budget Office publishes every year. They publish a 10-year budget baseline for agricultural and nutrition spending. The next one out, the official baseline for this year, will be published on May 12th. And those, any sort of, with the upcoming Farm Bill debate, anytime there's a proposed change in program spending, that will be so-called scored against the projected changes to the baseline. So CBO analysts will look at a proposed change in the Farm Bill, see what that will mean relative for the next 10 years, and then compare that to the current baseline. So the baselines really matter. This number that I'm showing on here actually came out of the February a preliminary baseline that showed aggregate, again, average spending at around $143 billion a year. Now this includes spending for the SNAP program and other things, as we'll see. So this is the classic Pac-Man slide that shows, this is essentially, kind of the monies that are actually mandatory spending that comes out of the Farm Bill. Some of these programs actually expire at the end of this year, but most are things like SNAP program are there. They will continue regardless of whether or not there's a Farm Bill. But you can see that projected spending, most of that is in the SNAP program. We do have a little bit and I say a little bit, these are still quite large money, for average spending for crop insurance, the price and income support programs, and then all conservation programs. Now, there's a whole lot of other things done in farm bills that authorize the USDA to implement certain types of programs, but they may be subject to appropriations. And so those get all, whether or not those get implemented very much depends on annual appropriations. These, on the other hand, are mandatory. That is, they are essentially entitlements. They have to be paid if producers are enrolled in. So if we look out over the last, or the next 10 years, CBO projects that for at least the Commodity Credit Corporation, these are the price and income support programs, about 75% goes to wheat, feed grains, and soybeans. And you can see the other major row crops like rice or upland cotton, you're really up to about 95%. Peanuts, and dairy really account for pretty much all the projected spending. Vince is going to talk about sugar in a moment, but again, this is almost nothing. It's a rounding error at just a few $1 million, and Vince will go into all the wheres and wherefores with that. So again, the CCC spending itself is largely driven by price and revenue-based programs. So these are counter-cyclical programs. When prices are low, these payments are very, very high. And as you can see here in the projections, at least within that gray portion of the bar, that CBO expects commodity prices to remain fairly high, and because of that, expects that over the next 2 or 3 years, at least, that those payment CCC spending will be quite low. As prices drop and fall over the baseline, then CBO expects those prices to increase. Now, that has some implications. There's some controversy, or I shouldn't say controversy, just disagreements over what prices actually are going to look like over the next 10 years. CBO has one view. USDA also puts out a 10-year baseline. Their prices are a little higher, so they would actually show smaller spending. And those are the sorts of things that will differ, but the numbers that actually count towards the so-called scoring on these bills is what CBO estimates here. Okay, I'm going to conclude. I know I've gone on way too long, but the U.S. actually has to notify to the WTO trade distorting support. And there's, by virtue of the Uruguay round agreement, they have some bindings, that is upper limits in terms of what can be spent on agriculture in something calculated called the aggregate measurement of support, or AMS. All to say is over the last few years, we've actually seen those levels of support increase a lot, be very, very close to the so-called AMS, or the bound levels of 19.1. But that doesn't tell the full story. If you include a lot of other categories of support, you can see that we are well in excess of that $19.1 billion. If you add in the other categories that are considered de minimis under certain rules under the WTO, and that's sort of been the source of some criticism at the WTO. But I think I'm going to stop here and turn it to Barry.
Yeah, Thank you very much, Joe, for that overview of policy. And I
You
guess
may have to
before
click
we
twice to
go
get to
next to Dr. Goodwin, I just want to say for those of you who are live streaming the event, there's a couple ways you can ask questions. The first is if you're on Twitter, hashtag AEI Farm Bill is one way to ask questions. Another way is to email Benjamin Gorin, who his email is benjamin.goren@aei.org. So if you email Benjamin or through Twitter, you can ask questions as well. So that was a kind of a general overview of Title I. Next, we're going to talk about ARC and PLC, two programs that came out of the last Farm Bill we did with divided government. So,
okay, yeah, thanks Eric, and thanks to AEI for putting this together. I think Vince has organized some great sessions here that we've been having. So I'm going to talk about Title I programs, which we call for the last 75, 80 years, whatever it's been since the first act, the commodity title. And it has, the basic commodity provisions. And as Eric said, price loss coverage, PLC, and ARC, agriculture risk coverage, are the two main mechanisms here. Price loss coverage is really a support mechanism that's triggered if the marketing year average price falls beneath some reference point, or if prices got down low enough that the loan rates would actually be triggering, then that puts a lower bound on PLC payments. The ARC is really like a revenue insurance, assurance type program. There's two versions of it. The county level, county coverage operates on yields at the county level, and I'll talk about the mechanics of that here in a second. There is an individual coverage option that almost nobody takes. I believe I have in here, it's less than about 0.9%. So it's very, very low number of farmers that have taken that. So it's not terribly relevant to the big picture. We also have marketing assistance loans, which have been around for a long time. These are, as I say, they're loans that can use the commodity as collateral, but more often farmers would just take the payment if the price was beneath the loan rate, which sets the support level. And those have not been terribly relevant in recent years because prices are so far above loan rates. But that doesn't mean that they don't matter. If prices fall, they would have to fall quite a bit. Not only would we see PLC and ARC payments, we'd also, again, see some LDP payments kicking in. But it's yet another support mechanism that's tied directly to what's being produced. And then there are some other programs which I think are quite interesting. In fact, there's several disaster relief programs for livestock and tree fruit producers. Dan's going to talk about the dairy policies, the dairy margin coverage. Vince is going to talk about sugar. I lined the order of that up just right, I think. And what I think is one of the more interesting things are some of these administrative provisions and the limits and means testing that are in there. It's important to remember with PLC and ARC that the payments are tied to base, not the actual production. And Joe just mentioned our limits on aggregate support, the AMS, $19.1 billion. We call these in the jargon of economics decoupled payments because they're not tied to actual production, with the exception of LDPs or marketing loans. And I think an important question, Joe's worked intimately with the WTO issues much more than I have, but as I followed the discussion of some of this, I really wonder if our Congress really cares a great deal about our obligations. We see if you depending on which policies you include there, we've been in violation of this limit for some time. A couple of nice quotes. I won't read both of them, but I think this one by Senator Josh Hawley is particularly relevant to the discussion, perhaps concerning, I think. But he said, we need to return production to America, secure critical supply chain, and encourage domestic innovation. Pulling out of the WTO is a good first step. Now, I don't know that that's ever really going to happen, but you do see it in the political jargon, and I think it does reflect the mentality of how our policymakers view these obligations. The base is, again, a fixed level of acreage and yield that would be eligible for PLC and ARC benefits. Marketing loans or marketing loan gains are based upon actual production, so that is coupled. In theory, at least, base has no firm tie to actual production, so it's not market distorting in theory because it's based upon something that happened in the past. You can see here really, and I think this is an issue that we're going to see a lot of discussion of, the fact that there's quite a bit of a difference between base acres and what's actually being planted for most crops. Soybeans are a place where you see planted acres greatly exceeding base, but for a lot of the other crops, you see the opposite thing. So the point here is that plantings do not tend to follow base in any significant way. So how these things operate, just a very high-level discussion of the mechanics. The growers can choose one, not both. Initially, when these were introduced, the choice was frozen for the life of the Farm Bill, but as I think Eric or Joe said, farmers like choices, and they later have been able to change the election for 2021, 22, and 23. PLC, again, if the effective price is less than the reference, they're going to receive a payment on that base. And they did add some provisions here in the last Farm Bill to allow the reference price to actually change over time if prices are moving substantially. The county level ARC is, again, if the county crop revenue is less than the benchmark, you're going to get a payment. Again, on base, the benchmark's 86% of a 5-year Olympic average of the product of county yields and county prices. The individual coverage, again, you see here 0.9%, very, very low. So PLC provides protection against low prices, and ARC provides protection when revenues are falling. That's really a statement that came out of one of the policymakers that really put these things together, at least the ARC. I think base updating is one of the more interesting issues that we should look at with this sort of thing. Originally, base was established in the early 1980s, and they initially froze the production that was eligible for support as a way of sort of constraining spending on these things. And when we had, coming out of the FAIR Act, fixed direct payments, and then we had the ad hoc market loss assistance, which later became countercyclical payments, which later became PLC in general terms. Those were an attempt to argue that, because it was paid on base, an attempt to argue that the payments were decoupled. And I think market loss assistance clearly was not, according to the provisions of the Uruguay Round Agreement on Agriculture, because it was triggered by market prices, despite the arguments that it's paid on base and is decoupled. Soybeans were added as a program crop in 2002. And at that point in time, farmers were given a range of options, very complicated options. I was working on this back then and trying to figure out and decipher what was best for any case was quite an exercise. But farmers were given a range of options to update that base, all right? And base updating was again permitted in 2014. There was a provision in the 2018 bill that allowed PLC yields to be updated yields only in 2020. Carl Zuloff determined that, one of my academic colleagues at Ohio State determined that allowing base updating would increase the base by 17%. I think you just saw that with the difference between base and actual production. I think a very, very interesting question is, at what point do these payments no longer become decoupled? When you're allowing base updating, the farmers may anticipate this opportunity, and that could affect their production decision. So I think one very interesting Title I question is, really, does base updating result in coupling these supposedly decoupled payments back to actual production? And I think it could be a WTO issue. Maybe Joe can speak on that when we have discussion. you can get an idea here really where the base acres are being enrolled, and you see a big switch here from ARC to PLC, and I'll show you the reasons why here in a minute. You can sort of ignore the green line. That's ARC at the IC level, and it's a different scale. As you see, it's very low. And program outlays sort of follow a similar picture here. You see that PLC is really where a lot of the spending is projected to be. Again, going forward. Now, why do farmers really favor PLC? Remember that the support level is based upon 5-year average of revenues and yields. And you can see here, if you go back 5 years looking at things, the prices were quite low. And so if you take ARC, you're going to be locking in a low level of revenue. Now, it applies to PLC payments as well, but you're not basing it on this, what was locked in. And this is, I took this yesterday, so these are the most recent prices. Payment limits, one of the most important, interesting things. Very quickly, I'd say, nope, there are no payment limits in practice. In theory, there is. You see what the numbers are here, PLC and ARC, 125,000. Important, no limit on crop insurance subsidies. That's something that comes up from time to time. There's no means testing, no limit there. To be eligible, you have to be actively engaged in farming, but there's a very loose definition of that. I think a conference call can constitute a contribution of management, thereby being actively engaged. A spouse is automatically actively engaged. That doubles payment limits. Each family member that's actively engaged is eligible. The 2018 Farm Bill, very interesting, expanded the definition of family members for eligibility to include spouses, children, first cousins, nephews, nieces, lineal ancestors, and descendants. Everybody in the family is eligible there, just about. The AGI, the limit is $900,000. You're not eligible for these payments if your adjusted gross income over the last 3 years exceeds $900,000, unless more than 75% of that came from farming. That's most cases. There's some nuances to this. It's doubled for married couples. The bottom line here, Congress is not really serious about payment limits in my point of view. Okay, thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Goodwin. So ARC and PLC, major commodity programs. And now we're going to skip over to Dr. Sumner, coming to us from the largest dairy state in the U.S., who's going to talk about something very different, the dairy programs.
Yeah, thanks. And I will say, Barry, never have been serious about payment limits. And it's for sure.
It's a nice story, though. It's a nice thing to talk about.
Dairy subsidies amount to a couple of $1 billion a year, off and on, up to about 5% of farm revenue, usually less than that. The main program distributes cash in ways that have almost no effect on aggregate milk production, and I'm going to talk about some of the issues that Barry talked about in broad terms, very specifically about the dairy margin coverage program. The other thing I'll talk about just for a minute at the end is the milk marketing orders, where there is lots of controversy, lots of action going on right now within the dairy industry, all parts of the dairy industry except consumers. And we'll see if that ends up being part of the Farm Bill. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. They have another mechanism. It's not a mandatory program in the Farm Bill like we've been talking about till now. But these milk marketing orders are a regulatory program that can be handled through a very elaborate judicial process, quasi-judicial process of hearings and the like. And we'll see which way they go with the sort of changes that industry is pushing for. And I'll have a few things to say about that. Let me just say it's hard to find any general public good rationale for these subsidies and regulations. In the first place, they don't help the poor. And if we want to do something for rural America, if we want to do something for the rural poor, if we want to do something for poverty on farms, with respect to dairy, this isn't it. Many poor people work on farms. They're hired employees. These programs have nothing to do with that. And if anything, they disadvantage those hired employees on farms. So if you I can't say that too much, so let me just put an exclamation point there. Secondly, they don't improve market effectiveness, if anything, or efficiency. If anything, they go the other way. They do stimulate, they don't stimulate productivity, though they stimulate production a bit through government transfers. In fact, on every one of these dimensions, the programs that I'm going to talk about go in the opposite direction. There's also a million regulations having to do with dairy farms, as there are for plenty of other farms, especially these days having to do with greenhouse gas regulations. And we may find the most important part of the Farm Bill having to do with dairy farms is in an energy title or a climate title or something like that. That's certainly true in California, where there's substantial work on dairy digesters, for example, as a greenhouse gas program. Here's one slide that summarizes where the milk industry's gone over the last 35 years or so. Milk per cow has gone up very steadily. Not all over the country, as it turns out. Milk per cow has been stagnant in California, maybe even down a little bit. After being a national leader, California is now the lowest in milk per cow among the major dairy states. Two good reasons. One, feed prices are very high. You don't feed your cow as much, you don't give as much milk. And two, California has shifted a little bit more to a breed of cattle, Jersey cows, that don't give quite as much milk. They give more milk solid and they don't eat as much. So maybe they're economic. So milk per cow is a standard measure of productivity, but it's not the only one. But it's steadily rising, especially in the major dairy states, especially among commercial dairy farms of some substantial size. Milk production then has gone up about 60% in the last 35 years, large, whereas the number of cows is fairly stagnant, though still down about 10% from where we started. I find it hard to read these things against a blue background, but the green line there is the milk price minus the feed cost. It's the way the dairy margin program is defined. And the green line is where payments get triggered on the first 50,000 hundredweight or so, a farm with about 200 cows. And so most of the last, since the program started in January 2019, most of that period has been triggering payments for the first 50,000 hundredweight that a farm might have. But it's triggered no payments, thanks, at the $4 margin, which is the other trigger point for payments. You can also get payments if you pay for $5, $6, $7, or $8. Premiums tend to be very high for that, so the net of payments minus what you paid to buy it has been negative for those. So this program ends up being quite simple. It passes out money for the first 50,000 hundredweight that you produce, which is all of production for most farms in the eastern part of the United States, and a very small amount of production relative to most of the larger dairy farms that are primarily in the western part of the United States, Midwest and West. And what that means is that for those dairies over a 2, 3, 4 year horizon like this, it's essentially a lump sum payment. They can plan on getting something like $50,000 a year out of the program. Here's a little example. Here's a calculation of some data from the program. And I want to say Ji-Sung Yu and Georgie Gabrielian, two former students of mine, worked with these numbers and have a paper that's just forthcoming in the American or AEPP, whatever that stands for. You can Google it, which goes through a lot of these numbers very usefully and carefully. And what you find is up through 2022, where we have hard data, we probably average $500,000 or $600,000 a year. 2023 looks like a big payment year, 1.5 million or so. Now, the year's only March. We have January and February in the box. Surely those payments are large already. We'll see how the rest of the year plays out. It may not be 1.5 million. It could be 2 million. It could be, or 2 billion. It could be 1 billion. Let me give you a little example to bring it back to the farm. take a typical farm, say in New England, 80 cows, a couple hundred, 1,000 hundredweight. That farm will get about 5% of its revenue. It's actually 4.7 some percent of its revenue from the DMC. Not every year, it goes up and down each year, but over a 2, 3, 4 year horizon, that's what they can count on. The same's true of a farm with about 200 cows, 50,000 hundredweight. A typical commercial dairy farm that's staying in business in Wisconsin these days. Again, about 5% of revenue. They've paid $7,500 to get into the program, but they get more than that by about $50,000. The big dairy farm, typical say in Idaho or West Texas, will be about 2,000 cows. They're also getting $50,000 for the program. They sign up because it's real money. And in fact, they're more likely to sign up than anybody else because they have an accountant to make sure they sign up for things that are free money. The last thing I want to say about I want to talk about milk marketing orders for a minute, and for exactly 1 minute. The program's been around for 90 years or so. Every few years they say we've got to change this program, so they add a few more bells and whistles to it. It's become more complicated all the time. We now have 11 regional marketing orders scattered around. And what this does is say to a milk buyer, if you're in this program, what you pay for milk depends on what you're going to use the milk for. Dairy farmers, it doesn't depend on what that farm's milk is used for. It depends on what the average is in their community. And the price is highest for the fluid milk or the beverage milk products. Why would you do this? The program says orderly marketing. It's in fact caused just the opposite. There's chaos in the milk market. People are in and out of the marketing orders all the time. There's over-order premiums. There's deep pooling. And there's milk shipped from high-cost regions to low-cost regions. And lots of water basically shipped around the United States because of this program. And this is where I'm going to cue Norbert and maybe Vince to sing a duet here. The only reason I can come up for why we have this program is tradition. And if you'll remember Fiddle on the Roof, guys, tradition. And it did occur to me that Tegeve was a dairy farmer in the Fiddle of the Roof. When he introduces the song Tradition, he's going through the village passing out milk. Let me stop there. That too.
He did want to be a rich man, yeah. All right, thank you very much. And so that, I guess I want to clarify one thing. The article that Dr. Sumner was talking about, Applied Economics and Policy Perspectives, a really good article if you want to look that up. Last, we have Dr. Vincent Smith, who's going to talk about the sugar policy, which I have to think. I teach an ag policy class, and we talk about the sugar policy a lot. So I'll have you talk a little bit more about it.
Well, before I begin, nobody wants to hear me sing. I got kicked out of my third grade choir, the only person in the year to be kicked out of the third grade choir because my singing was so good. Sort of. Anyway, so let's talk about the sugar program and the Farm Bill. And earlier I described it as perfidy. Perfidy is, of course, in the eye of the beholder, and others may like the program a lot, especially if they receive benefits from it. And that would be about 4,100 producers of cane and sugar beets in this country. And that's all there are, by the way. Oh my goodness, I can't read this either. I don't know if you guys can. Who put the blue background on? It was white when I put it together. So what are the objectives of the program? Fundamentally, to raise the price of sugar paid to the farmer when they deliver their sugar beets or their sugar cane to the processing process. To raise the prices received for refined sugar and the net revenues of sugar refineries. The owners of those refineries, by the way, are by and large exactly the same people because these are producer-owned cooperatives. So if you try to distinguish between refineries and farmers, for sugar, essentially they're the same folks. To avoid making the program politically toxic by claiming that there are no costs to taxpayers. To believe that fiction, you have to believe that consumers don't pay taxes, all 330 billion of them. It's a straw man, but it resonates among some congressional delegations. John Boehner, who is in many ways one of the more fun speakers of the House, if there's ever been a fun speaker of the House, described the sugar program as a Stalinist command and control approach. And he's right in a fundamental sense, in that it's a supply control program. There are marketing limits on domestic production. Refineries are given a quota every year determined by the Secretary of Agriculture, and there's significant quota limits on imports. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But essentially that means there's a fixed amount of sugar that's going to flow to the US market for consumers in any given year. Little bits of wiggle room there, but essentially that's the bottom line. US sugar the US sugar total supply comes from domestic production and from imports. Imports have increased gradually over the last 10 or 12 years, and now are typically in the 3 million metric ton range. And then domestic production has also increased, mainly because of technological innovation in the sugar beet farm sector, and specifically the adoption of GMO sugar crops. You may think you're GMO free, but if you eat any sort of cupcake, no, you're wrong, just because of the sugar. Personally, I have no problem with that, and parenthetically, sugar beet yields have risen from the mid-20 tons per acre in about 2010 to typically over 30, 33 tons per acre today. And that's a technological innovation issue. There are no more acres being planted sugar beets today than there were in 2010. There's just more per acre. This actually created some stress for the sugar program because of the way the program operates in constraining at the farm level acres planted. In terms of very recent distribution of sugar from source, about 41% of US sugar comes from sugar beet production in the United States, about 33% from cane sugar, and about 26% today from imports. That's up a little bit from 2010-12 when it was more like 20%. The program works with import quotas. They are country specific. Quite notoriously, really, the Dominican Republic, for some reason, and we can discuss that perhaps in Q&A, gets the largest quota for US sugar imports. That's not unrelated to the ownership of the plantations in the Dominican Republic where sugar is produced. There are low tariffs for in-quota imports from any given country, about 6 cents a pound. Much higher, in fact, typically prohibitively higher tariffs on over-quota imports from a given country. So if your quota is 10,000 tons, up to 10,000 tons, the tariff rate is about 6%. Beyond that amount, it becomes much larger. The next slide should say, the next line should say, since 2014, not 24. Nothing like trying to be a future guesser. But since 2014, Mexico has effectively operated with a voluntary export quota on its shipments to the US at around about 1 million to a bit over 1 million metric tons a year. And that's part of the source for the increase, that's part of the reason for increased aggregate total imports. You ship, if you're a Mexican sugar refiner, you ship under license from Mexico into the US, and that's how things are controlled there. Often countries with TRQs, however, don't fill them. So obviously a minor but potentially helpful reform to the program is to let other countries fill those unfilled quotas, which actually has occurred recently under the aegis of the US Trade Representative's Office. Just as an indicator of where sugar is coming from, other countries than the 4 largest non-Mexican sources of imports contribute most of the TRQ-provided sugar. The largest country in terms of quota is the Dominican Republic, followed by Brazil, followed by the Philippines, and followed by Australia. And if you just look at that, you think, well, why is the world that way? But again, that's something we can talk about later. The domestic controls are allocated through what are called marketing allotments that operate at the sugar refinery level. They have a production limit in terms of how much can be supplied. Those refineries, which are all cooperatives owned by farmers, especially in the case of sugar beets, then tell each grower how much land they can plant to sugar beets. Now, something I want to note. In congressional testimony, frequently over the last 20 years, the sugar lobby has pulled in a sugar grower who says, I am a sugar farmer, leaving the impression that that's all they raise. That is compellingly not true. If you're raising sugar beets, you're only going to plant a given acre to sugar beets once every 3 or 4 years. So you must be doing something else with the land the other years, and they're being planted to other crops like corn, like wheat, like hay, and so on. So the claim that if the sugar program goes, sugar farmers will all disappear, the farms will not disappear, the owners will not disappear, but less land will be planted on those farms to sugar. It's not that that world will disappear. It's a useful fiction in front of a congressional committee. It's very misleading. So the limits are set by the Secretary of Agriculture, as I mentioned, and the limit is on domestic production. There's a price support program through a marketing loan program that is non-recourse. If, for some reason, prices in the US fall below, for beet sugar, 25.38 cents per pound, for cane sugar, 19.75 cents per pound, you can sell your sugar to the government in a non-recourse way. That is, you can't reclaim what you just sold if prices in the market go above what you sold your sugar for. That sugar has in recent years has been gotten rid of by selling it to ethanol plants for processing into ethanol through the feedstock flexibility program. What are the impacts of the program? Well, over the past 30 years or so, on average, prices paid by sugar users have been substantially higher than world market prices, about 50% higher. And if I get lucky, yep, there we go. That's what that says. Now the problem is, do I get back? Yes. Total revenues are increased for the sugar program, for the sugar industry, by $3 to $4 billion a year. These numbers come from work by John Begin, who's been the leading researcher in this area. Net revenues, the difference between producing some more sugar in terms of cost and the revenues generated, those effects are estimated typically to be over $1 billion a year, perhaps as much as $2 billion. The number I've often used is 1.2 billion. That's sort of a mid-range. There are 3,500 sugar beet growers in this country as of 2017. That number is almost certainly lower today because, as with every other part of, or most of the parts of the commercial sector of agriculture, farm sizes are going up. And there are 630 cane growers. So those benefits are being shared between about 4,100 producers of sugar at roughly $250,000 a farm. Now, so there are some very large producers. There's one family in particular that is exceptionally large producer of cane, and there you're talking literally over $100 million for one organization in net benefits. The cost to you If you like the average amount of chocolate and sugar-based products is $11 a year, $44 or thereabouts for a family of 4. But the benefits to a very small number of farmers are very large, which explains why the sugar producers are the largest donors of campaign contributions and in the form of lobbying efforts of all of the farm sector for a very small number of farms. That just shows where US and world wholesale sugar prices have gone. The red line is the US, the green line is world prices. And there's clearly significant benefits from this program. And at this point, the last thing I want to talk about is one item on this slide. You will hear, and I've read, and I think every one of us on this panel have read, papers put out by the sugar growers lobby that claim that removing the sugar program would lose 50,000 or more jobs. Other people, meaning economists who are not being paid by the sugar lobby, cannot find those numbers. And typically the estimate is that we are losing jobs, particularly because of movement of the candy and confectionery industry to other places. And the net effect is a 10,000 to 20,000 job loss to the economy a year. And it's worth coming back and mentioning, on the farm, the job impacts, at least on the sugar beet side of the world, are very modest, because the labor used to plant sugar beets would be used to plant corn, wheat, other crops. And with that, let me finish. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Smith. Another example of an industry where you have costs that are spread over a wide margin and benefits that are very concentrated, and that group being very successful in their lobbying efforts. So thank you for that. Last, we have our discussant, who I didn't mention before is the president of an association that I've been a part of, all of us have been a part of our entire careers, the Agricultural and Applied Economics Association. Dr. Wilson serves as that president right now. So we are honored to have you here today.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you all for this opportunity to share with you. When I saw the slides earlier, it made me think of the class that I teach on food policy, and I use Park Wilde's book, Who's at Tufts, and he talks about the importance of thinking about why do we talk about policy? And I actually want to encourage us to think a little bit about this, because a lot of what we heard today was, here are what the policies are, here are some of the effects. But the question I want to raise is, but why do we have these policies as we do? Now, I remember the 1933, as if I were there, but the 1933 Agricultural Adjustment Act, when it was originally created, there were a great deal of concern about price gouging, the price parity of what the experience of farmers. And it's interesting, in all the discussion, I really didn't hear anything about the reason for the policies other than, as Dan referenced, Fiddler on the Roof, tradition. What's the public good provisioning that's being dealt with these policies? What are the externalities that are being dealt with? Are there examples of imperfect competition or imperfect information that's driving these policies? And this isn't a criticism, this is just a question of, so why do we continue to do these policies given this set of reasons that we typically say we can intervene in markets? I want to change from just that set of issues of why do we then have these policies to ask some questions around the priorities that USDA has laid out. So the Secretary of Agriculture has these 4 priorities of racial justice and rural development, climate smart agriculture, expanding markets, and an interest in food and nutrition security. And I think, Dan, you did mention that these policies, or at least the dairy policy, may actually be causing some level of damage in this respect. And I realize that Congress doesn't necessarily have to respond to what the priorities of the Secretary of Agriculture. But this does raise some important questions of, well, given these priorities, where do these policies land? Where do the Title I policies land? And it does make me also think about who, as Dr. Smith has made very clear, who are the beneficiaries of these programs? And if we begin to think about, are those benefits distributed across a wide swath of U.S. agriculture, And if not, then why do we continue to pursue these policies? Now, I do understand, and I'm very aware that these are politically sensitive. There is a great deal of consternation. In the conversation earlier, this idea of if we're really concerned about climate smart agriculture, how do these Title I policies support or diminish this effort to address climate change? Again, I'm asking more questions than providing answers, but I think these are useful questions for us to consider. And the last thing concerns of the issue around food security and nutrition security. And I know this is not a topic, nutrition security is one that I think is an evolving topic and that we're really starting to think a lot more about. But I've worked in the area of food security, and while it is important to understand that these policies may have some implications on price, the question is, how can we use this set of policies to actually improve nutritional access? Of course, we know that the Farm Bill is predominantly going towards food security in terms of this food stamp program, but these policies raise some important questions about what are the prices that people actually are paying. And when we think about nutrition, and I'm not going to fall into the sort of the line of thinking that if you got rid of these programs, you would necessarily improve fruit and vegetable production. But there is some questions to be raised about, are we spending money to actually encourage certain production and not spending money to encourage other types of production? I know that there has been interest in trying to subsidize, example, fruits and vegetable consumption, but maybe another way of thinking about this, what are we doing in terms of research and development that would allow consumers to actually be able to access these products more? So those are my overarching comments and sort of questions for the panel to say, what is the history? Why are we still doing the policies that we're doing? And how do these align with sort of the set of objectives that at least the Secretary of Agriculture has implemented, but I would imagine different Secretaries of Agriculture over time have implemented similar sets of objectives. Now, each speaker talked about some important aspects of the particular programs that they were looking at, and I must admit it is always surprising to see, one, just how much we've changed from earlier 2000s. I remember the 1994 Farm Bill and the amount of payments that were going out to farmers, and to see where we are today. But recognizing that there are a series of other policies, these ad hoc policies that come up depending on circumstances that are really beneficial to producers and are really expensive. But the overarching theme is that some of these payments generally have gone down. And this is a conversation I think that when we hear discussions about farm policy, I think we sometimes overlook. Those who aren't deeply engaged in these discussions sometimes miss this point. And so I'm really appreciative of that level setting that was presented. I think it's important to understand the complexity of some of these programs and why or how they may run against or run afoul of the WTO. And so I'm grateful for that commentary on our sort of commitments and how we deal with AMS. And one of the things that, as someone who studied international trade and understanding that there are gains from trade and that globally we benefit, and that when we implement policies that actually could have distorting effects, that actually hurts everyone in many respects. And so we have to take into consideration what are we gaining from these policies, and then how does that fit into the larger WTO context. Dairy policy has been something I actually worked on some years ago, actually the California dairy policy, actually with Dan as my major professor. So it's always a little tricky when you're here with your major professor. And even it's been 25 years, but he's still my major professor. So I appreciate, Dan, your comments about the current complexity of the milk marketing orders, and it's just surprising that this program still exists in its way, and the way that it creates, as you said, chaos. It still creates chaos. And lastly, the sugar program, 4,100 producers. I think that says a great deal about what that program is doing, and in terms of the benefits. I am intrigued, Vince, you said that the Dominican Republic receives the largest quota, and there seems to be a backstory, and I would love to hear the backstory there. So I'll end my comments at that point. I thank you all for these really interesting and important conversations, and I think this is how we begin to think through what the Farm Bill can look like. So thank you.
Yeah. All right, thank you very much. So now we're going to enter into the Q&A portion. And again, if you do have questions, you can submit those online, either through Twitter at #AEI Farm Bill, or send an email to benjamingorin@aei.org. And I guess we'll just start by just kind of going down the line. I think Dr. Wilson brought up a lot of interesting questions, and just hand it over to the panel to maybe respond to some of those questions that he brought up.
Want me to start?
Start with Joe.
Great.
Yeah.
No, and thanks, Norbert. I think and thanks to all the fellow panelists. Yeah, we've been dealing with these programs for a long, long time, and I feel like certainly AEI events, what we're saying today hasn't changed much over time. And trying to think in terms of, okay, well, obviously people haven't been listening to us, but then you got to think, okay, well, what could be done? What could be done that would actually push things forward? And Norbert actually has raised a few, this whole debate over repurposing, putting in, trying to improve outcomes, public goods, introduce public goods into this, because after all, the charade of the 30s, that, or I'm not saying the 30s was a charade, but sort of bringing farm income up to parity with non-farm income. Well, gee, they did a great job. Now it's above. And so without that rationale, then what are we doing with these programs? And so can we get things like improved climate performance or improved nutrition and everything? And I think some of this is agricultural policies are sort of poor instruments, right? Nutrition, I think the last thing you want to do is yank subsidies away from, I mean, it may be a really good idea to cut subsidies from one set of commodities, but to say, okay, now we're going to subsidize fruits and vegetable production, I think you'd end up with a lot of inefficiencies. And I think the work, at least that I've done with colleagues at IFPRI, suggests if you're going to do that sort of stuff, then hitting consumers with improving income of poor households so they can purchase more, or subsidies or taxes on various items. That's a tricky business too, I might add. The other thing is, and I'm just turning this last comment to sugar, because sugar, okay, yeah, they are, look, the thing sugar has going that these other commodities don't is they can say, we aren't costing you a dime, right? I mean, in terms of federal dollars. And as you say, the consumer side of it is, yeah, the consumer costs in aggregate may be large, but for individuals or households, it's pretty small, it's pretty minimal. I mean, you can blow that on 2 cups of coffee down the street. So the idea is, well, what if you were to make sugar much like the other programs? Say, instead of having a non-recourse loan, have a marketing loan. And if you have a marketing loan, why not paying it on base acres and let them plant whatever they want to do, but still have a sugar payments? And then you can actually think about getting rid of the suspension agreement with Mexico, bring in more sugar, let producers actually get that. I mean, the price support is sort of the classic bad economic policy for all the deadweight loss. Consumers have to pay for it, and you end up having these marketing allotments, so you're taking resources out of production and other sorts of things. I'm not necessarily advocating that this is a preferred policy, because I think that any one of us up here would say get rid of it all, but
I like the idea of a big check going to Florida. That's really $500 million.
Yeah, well, then you get into Barry's issue on payment limits. You'd have a couple of families down, or at least a couple of brothers down there probably trying to rearrange holdings and everything. But I'm just saying there's a program that's pretty bad insofar right now, but allow some flexibility, allow these guys to do something else. All right, I've made my piece.
Yeah, any other responses to Dr. Wilson's comments?
Dr. Glauber's for that.
I do want to say, my favorite AEI presentation was, I think, down in the Hill maybe a decade ago. And the sugar lobbyist, I was talking about sugar, the sugar lobbyist who was there, very good economist, a clever fellow. He came in with his Starbucks cup of coffee and he says, look, I went to Starbucks, sugar's free. Vince, how cheap do you want it? It's free. Come on. The second response, of course, is Vince is the only guy in America who thinks we all ought to be eating more sugar, so he wants it to be cheaper. Now, whether it's already free or you want it to be cheaper, I don't see how this is a winner for America, Vince. How am I doing? How am I doing?
Really bad.
And the sugar lobbies pointed that out.
I mean, they win all the time.
Dan is entirely correct in that the sugar lobby comes in and says, doesn't cost anybody anything, except it does.
How cheap you want it?
There's a little bit of a touch. It's a two-edged sword for the sugar lobby, saying, well, behind closed doors, say, well, we're keeping the price of sugar high and we know sugar is bad for you. Two responses. If you want sugar prices to be high, you don't have to give one family $125 million or more dollars every year to do it. You can tax the stuff.
Well, there's a tariff.
But
So you already have that.
You already
have that in place.
But
It's not going to go away.
But you can tariff it even more. I mean, you can do it. The other response is, how good is high fructose syrup for you compared to sugar? Because that's, as we've seen, is where when sugar prices go up, the quantity of high fructose syrup that is incorporated in all sorts of products from Diet Coke, well, not Diet Coke, I guess, but Coke. Coca-Cola, not the other Coke.
But HFCS has gone down.
Yeah,
Recently, it's gone down, absolutely.
So-
but it's not just the families in
No,
Florida
I-
and sugar beet growers that are benefiting from this. It's
Yeah.
corn growers as well.
The corn growers are benefiting too. I mean, but the scandal of the sugar program is just how concentrated the benefits are and how scurrilous the claim is that it is free. It's completely untrue. I think the issues that you've raised, and we've skipped Barry's, but you're not off the hook, Barry, here.
No, I've got a few comments here too
Yeah.
I'd like to make.
One other comment about why the programs stay in place. There's a famous article by Gary Becker and a co-author, Gary Becker won the Nobel Prize, says, once you put a program in place, once the feds put a program in place, unless it becomes catastrophically bad for the economy, it's hard to get rid of it. Dan has a different analog for this story.
I say tradition.
Well, you say tradition. And you used to say total farm bill spending is a very small share of a $4 trillion or $4.5 trillion federal budget. So it gets lost in the weeds. But one of the reasons why these programs are sustained, my previous research assistant and I looked at where the sugar lobby's money goes. It goes to congressional representatives in 48 states. One of the two states it doesn't go to, for some reason, is New Hampshire, where you live free or die. 48 states. So what does that tell you about buying support within Congress? Classic, what economists call rent-seeking. What many people would worry about as the sort of general corruptness of money in politics. And it matters here. But the other issue that you raised, and I'm taking more than my fair share of time, is this issue of providing public goods, and particularly climate-related impacts, as that's the cause of the day, for very good reason, I might add. I think I'm worried about climate change because the most brilliant scientists in the world say you need to worry about climate change. Then the question becomes, what is the best way of approaching climate change in terms of emissions, not only from US agriculture, but from global agriculture? And paying farmers to adopt cover crops isn't the way to go. Repurposing farm bill funding for that is going to have virtually minimal impacts, as I understand the evidence. Barry, I know you've thought about this more than I have.
Yeah, just an unrelated point, but I think you need to keep in mind the fact that about 45% of farmland is being operated by a tenant, and ask the question, who's really benefiting from these policies? And then let's say that we make them all go away tomorrow. They've been capitalized
Programs,
in.
not the tenants.
Yeah, well, maybe, maybe both, I don't know. But yeah, the programs, they've been, Illinois cropland went up about 20% in the last year or two. It's amazing what's happening with farmland. It's because these benefits are capitalized in. You take them away, there's going to be some huge capital losses by growers. And so you need to contemplate buyouts or something like that, which those of us who are naive thought the FAIR Act was a beginning of a buyout of ag policy. But it's not always the producer that's keeping all of these dollars. A lot of it is passed through to landowners who have, in many cases, absolutely nothing to do with agriculture. So.
Well, and that actually brings us to an interesting question that came in. Thanks to Julian Silk for submitting a question. So you guys all talked about kind of the impacts of some of these programs and how some of them may be fairly egregious or very egregious. But the question is, don't these programs then help farmers stay in business versus some real estate developer just coming in and buying the land and building a house? So if you got rid of these programs, would the farmers on those lands be negatively impacted?
Yeah,
What's wrong with that?
but let's be clear. Barry's right. He says people who own the farmland aren't involved in agriculture, but in fact, they very much are. They take a good bit of their wealth and they provide capital for agriculture to do what it does. And either hired managers or people who run farms don't have to take their wealth and invest it in the same basket, so to speak, in farmland. So I think investors in farmland, whether they're heirs or widows or hedge funds, serve a really useful purpose in the productivity of U.S. agriculture. And the fact that owners of inelastic resources benefit from anything, whether it's basketball players or farmland owners, is the way the economy works. People who own inelastically supplied resources always gain, whether they're professors or hedge funds owning farmland. That seems to me something you like. The question about whether or not government program payments keep particularly small farms or farmland owners in business is almost always almost completely false. So there is this little slice, and let me use, and I gave some examples from the dairy industry. This dairy margin coverage program is a classic program, and it tailors a very substantial share of the payments to the smallest farms in the industry. They are leaving the business very quickly, very rapidly. They're being bought out by their next door neighbor or their cousin, putting 3 farms in Wisconsin together, or over the last 3 or 4 decades, 10 farms together. There's no evidence that the program has slowed that at all. It may cause a farmer to stay in business in 2021, to leave in 2022, or actually more likely 2023. Just like temporarily high prices can cause somebody to put off. Often what it does is keep people in the business until their equity is gone, so they leave with nothing. Whether or not this benefits anybody is really another question. It's very hard to find any substantial benefit. And this is from the DMC, which is really tailored much better than most of these other programs. The first thing I ever wrote for AEI was back when Bob Thompson was a youngster. And that had to do with targeting and the distribution of benefits and farm size distributions in the United States. And the answer is at that time, was there's just no evidence they were having any impact on the farm size distribution. And I would say that's still true. Mm-hmm. You see that in the press. You see the farm lobby urging people to think that it's mom and pop who are kept in business by farm programs. But there's just no evidence that that's true.
And in fact, Eric and I have written a series of papers based on USDA's annual surveys of agricultural production and revenues. the mid-size point, the 50% point, in terms of take the smallest farm, put it over here, and the largest farm over there, right in the middle, the median. The median farm on these major programs gets a few $1,000s out of the Title I programs for crops like corn and wheat, maybe $7,000 a year, I think is one of the numbers we looked at. The largest 1%, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Mm-hmm. Largest 10% accounts for over 50% of the total outlays. The monies are heavily concentrated on large farms that
produce all the stuff.
You
say this every time as though somebody could think this could be an income distribution program.
It's not.
It can't be.
It's not an income. I completely agree.
And it can't be rationalized that way.
But it does. But Dan, as you point out, it does tell you why these programs do nothing to save the small family farm or the struggling sharecropper with a very low income in Mississippi, or a small farm operating by people, by a few people who happen to be below the poverty line. Those people get essentially zero out of these programs. And that's why they don't help those farms, nor do they help the mid-sized farms survive. Yeah. They go to the large farms, which may have debt equity ratios that are relatively high, but have very substantial amounts of equity. And by design, because anybody who's looked at agriculture knows that because of weather, price volatility, revenues from an acre will go up and down a lot. So you do need equity to get from one year to the next, or, as most of the farms do, make sure that over 50% of your income comes from other activities in the farm. Farmers know how to manage risk. And the story that they need subsidized crop insurance because otherwise they can't manage risk is also another interesting tale that belongs in Beauty and the Beast.
Yeah, let's open it up to questions from the audience.
Dr. Merton Alexander, Institute for Academic Management. So you're mentioning the fact that the majority of these policies don't affect the small farmers. How does one then make it so that it does benefit the small farmers and not so much the large farmers? How do you make change to that? Because they don't have, clearly, lobbying money.
So let me start with your premise. Almost every small farm in the United States is very much a part-time enterprise. That is to say, almost every small farm that may generate $50,000 in gross revenue, has negative net income, and is obviously not a business enterprise of any substantial contribution for the family's income. So the first place I would start was saying, where could there possibly be a public good associated with taking taxpayer money and giving it to, for example, my father, who was a school teacher, my mother was also a school teacher, and ran a reasonably sized farm, still measured as small by Vince's scale. Is that something that should be subsidized for some public policy purpose? I can't think of a reason why. I think what you're talking about is common in some places in the world, which is lots of very poor people operating very small farms, trying to make a living on that farm. And there are very, very few of those in the United States. And the way to deal with those people is poverty programs, and to help them all you can with whatever has them stuck in poverty. And that's something that wouldn't be done through farm commodity programs or the dairy program or the cotton program. So the first thing to do is to think about these farms with low revenues and realize most of them aren't ever going to make any positive profit from that farm.
You're absolutely right. I lived 67 years in Switzerland, and so my mindset is back there because I looked at their farming system, which is totally different to what's here. And I'm not seeing the same concept here, and I'm wondering why, on a comparative analysis, why it's not the same here.
Yeah, Switzerland is wonderful. They'll pay you to helicopter cow up to the side of the hillside as a matter of I don't know, a tourist attraction or something. But it's also true that the very small farms in Switzerland, by gross revenue, aren't generating a lot of net positive income for the families. But here in particular, that's not the way to do it. And to think about poverty, and there's lots of rural poverty, I think is to focus directly as a poverty program, and especially a human capital program, rural schooling, things like that, to help people who might feel stuck there.
Well, and to add to that question a little bit, it was mentioned earlier that Congress doesn't seem to be interested in limits, payment limits, income limits, things like that. Would those types of things impact at least the distribution of payments, or maybe target some of those farms that are maybe more on the margin?
You know, I mean, if you ever did it, but they don't, see, as in a matter of industrial policy, if you think of this stuff as industrial policy, gee, we think we're in Congress, we think the price of corn should be higher than the market says it should be. Well, who's going to benefit? People that produce corn. And it won't be the small farm with 100 acres. It'll be roughly proportional to production, which is what we run. So I can't, if you say, why do you do something? The best answer is you do it for the reason you get what you pay for. And I'd say we have farm programs to pass out a bunch of money to old white guys. You know, I mean, that's what they do, and that seems to be probably why we have them. Searching for a public good rationale, I think, is a little tougher.
That's not necessarily a public good.
Yeah, I'm just.
You will clarify?
Yeah.
Barry, I think did you want to add something to that?
Well, I was just going to say, you know, what do we have against large farmers? And it goes back to what are we trying to do with these policies? And yeah, it's just what Dan said. It's a political mechanism, but forcing more small farms onto the end of the sector is going to decrease efficiency, and you know, there will be losses associated with that as well. I think there's a reason why farms are consolidating and getting bigger and bigger. So, and it has a lot to do with the production efficiency.
And behind all of this, there are a group of consultants / whatever who have some model farms. Every year, almost every one of their model farms shows a loss. And therefore,
the median farm shows about minus $20,000 loss on paper.
But they're looking at annual this year, what happens this year. Even if I accept the premise that they've got these model farms correct, which seems a little implausible, suppose I accept the premise, suppose I ask a different question, which is, let's start with two facts. Over the entire agricultural sector, the average farm family, as we call them, gets 80% of their income for tax reasons from other sources, from a spouse working. Most notably, I remember being at a meeting at Kansas State and having lunch with a guy who was a farm owner. He also was a neuroscience person. Why do you hold, you're the owner and operator of the land. Why are you why are you doing what you're doing if often you make negative income, which is the point that Barry just raised? The answer is your wealth accumulating. Even a small farm, you buy 10 acres, you're going to raise a selection of fruits and vegetables, not in California, in the Central Valley. You're using that, you're getting some income from that, you're getting a lot of tax advantages. On-paper losses from farming are very convenient for offsetting tax liabilities on other income, a fact that we've known for many years. So what are you doing here? Let's assume you're being an economic person. You're focusing on accumulating wealth, something that is rarely, if ever, mentioned in congressional hearings. You're not just trying to get some income from the land in order to put food on the table. And as an aside, only about 2% of all people who operate farms or own farms have incomes below the poverty line would qualify for large SNAP payments.
Yeah, there is something, though, in your question that bears emphasis, I think, that this nature of this thing, save the family farm, is a bit of a myth, is the point that's being made, I think.
Yeah.
But you can't ignore the fact that that mentality is out there in the general public. We have a farm aid concert each year. We have all of these different things to save the family farm. Let's have local agriculture through small farms. All of these things. It does not make, as an economist, a lot of economic pertinent to land, certainly. I mean, you may not be involved in day-to-day decisions in terms of what's being produced there. My point is that when we take away these benefits, there will be capital losses associated with that. Right. And there's a strong incentive, whether you didn't get those benefits to start with. I mean, they're capitalized into the value of the land, and when you purchased it, you're still going to lose as a result of that. So there is an economic incentive there on the part of individuals to preserve those benefits, to maintain the value of their assets.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. Let's go to a question in the back.
Yeah, a question for Barry or for whomever. If we took as a point of departure that agriculture is an inherently risky business, the revenue is the product of two random variables, price and yield per acre, that are not under the farmer's control. And it's an extremely capital-intensive industry. More capital investment per person employed than in the manufacturing sector of the United States. Is the problem of agriculture the volatility of revenue and the risk of farm financial failures if you have a catastrophic drop in revenue? And if we accepted this assumption of why the programs are important, why have the crop insurance program as it is, ARC payments, and all the other payments, why not roll them into one revenue insurance program? Price and yield probably have slight negative correlation, so you might have a little internal protection of the product of price times yield. But why have this variety of programs all dealing with either price or quantity or both? Why not just one?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of risky businesses out there. I mean, if you just look at small independent businesses, which are what farms are essentially, they come and go pretty quickly on Main Street, USA. I mean, it's just the nature of a market economy. There are plenty of mechanisms out there that farmers use to manage risk, which is a reason why they don't buy crop insurance unless it's heavily subsidized. One thing Vince mentioned is off-farm work and diversification. That we've seen again and again. That's the research shows has real benefits in reducing risk. So in terms of why is there such a diversity of programs, I think these programs are sort of made in a way to get benefits to each individual circumstance that's out there. Like we said I said in the base updating provisions. I mean, you had these very, very strange options that obviously were put in there to benefit, just a very, very small number of individuals who fit that little pocket there that would put money to them. So, a single, I've heard Bruce Babcock, maybe even at AEI here, talk about we need a single revenue insurance plan, eliminate some of these provisions. There's some appeal to that, I guess, but why do we need a subsidized crop insurance plan to start with? Because we have very good private financial markets for managing risk. And I don't buy the argument that those risks are too big to insure. They're not. There's never going to be a fluid private insurance program as long as you have 65% plus subsidies there that can't be competed with. So, I think it's the complications are there to benefit as many people as possible and confuse the rest of us, I think.
And just an addendum on the current federal crop insurance program. The only person whose financial risk is being managed is the farmers. But the incentives in that program are for the farmers to actually take more risk, which they do. The evidence of a bunch of studies shows that. So why are we trying to manage risk, deal with volatility of revenue, with a program that actually increases that volatility of revenue, but inherently because of the way it's constructed? It makes zero sense whatsoever. And in terms of climate change, for example, I've been in meetings where some people have said, let's make crop insurance better by offering more incentives to people to adopt greenhouse gas mitigating emissions. And frankly, I call that lipstick on a pig, because the actual program itself inherently moves production into fragile lands. And there's a reason why most other countries have not gone down the US route of providing, relative to the commercial cost of that program, a 70% subsidy to farmers that, as Joe has pointed out more than once, generates over $2 for every dollar of premium payment the farmer puts into the program. It's a terrible program from a public good perspective. It's a terrible program from stabilizing agricultural production in the country. It's just a terrible program.
Yeah, Vince and I have disagreed on this. I think we still disagree that private insurance markets, I think they would work in agriculture. Absolutely, they would work.
But I'm only talking about the federal program.
I know, and I'm saying though, they would be there if we did not have the federal program. It just wouldn't be what we see now.
Which makes it even more terrible from my perspective.
Yeah, plenty of programs to talk about that have been on past AEI
that's
webinars,
right.
and this is on top of it. Yeah.
Bob, to get back to the,
Bob's point, I mean, I do think that we are, right now we do have a revenue insurance program that you can insure up to 85 or even higher percent of your income. And on top of that, if you're a corn guy, you're also getting a ARC or PLC payment. I mean, so that's to me, it's really the double payment on this stuff. And they're not perfectly correlated. I know that you'll hear people will say, well, yeah, but one's base, one's planted, blah, blah, blah. But the fact is, they're essentially covering very, very similar risks in duplication. In that sense, I think there's a lot of improvements to be made.
That's like retiring from a government job and taking another salary or
Who
something.
would do that? Who would do that on the back
So
of the taxpayer?
that's a great point, because that brings up our next question. Thanks to Billy Hackett for this question. And this is actually one that I had as well, because there's been a lot of talk about raising PLC reference prices and in the upcoming Farm Bill. And his question is, does the market necessitate this shift in policy?
I don't know. You have higher prices. So the question is, do you think because you have higher prices, you need to bring up higher support prices? That doesn't.
The floor goes up, you got to raise the safety net up off the
Oh,
floor.
I see. Yeah,
Joe.
Dan, you're a good guy. I guess I don't quite see it. There's a little interesting aside I might add, because I mentioned briefly that CBO has a little different price outlook than USDA does. And part of the consequence of that, because they are presuming that they are estimating that prices will be lower over the next 10 years than, say, USDA does. Raising those reference prices have some big potential budget impacts, and I think that will hopefully put a damper on those sorts of moves. But
All right, we have a question for Dr. Wilson that came in that was talking about the role of the U.S. Thanks to Stephen Kafka for this. The role of the U.S. is to basically, we export a lot in food aid and we produce a lot of the global food consumption. So isn't keeping kind of a strong U.S. ag production system an important public good and maybe a reason why some of this should be subsidized?
Sure. No, thank you for the question. I would say there are lots of ways of ensuring a strong U.S. agriculture system. The work that we do in terms of research and education and extension are ways that we can actually strengthen our agricultural production. So I actually value that as an approach. And a lot of what we've heard here suggests that actual producers could make it. They could manage their risk through a variety of private means. So I think that there is real evidence to suggest that folks could be not only successful, but maybe even thrive under a different set of circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Right. Another question that came in was about, there was some discussion about WTO and kind of the interplay between that and domestic farm policies. Does the WTO just not have teeth? What kind of teeth do they have, and what sort of impact would, enforcing some of those WTO policies have on our domestic policies?
Dan may want to jump in here too, but so WTO has disciplines set up. The U.S. agreed to those disciplines when it joined the WTO back in 94, 95, or 94, and then implemented in 95. That sets boundaries. The WTO doesn't have a police force, so there's no real enforcement mechanism apart from other WTO members bringing a dispute against another member for what they perceive as violation of WTO rules, and at which point then that brings a so-called panel under the dispute settlement understanding. They look at the merits of the case, they make a ruling, and then if the party, the respondent or complainant don't appeal the ruling, then you have to implement the ruling. Or if you choose not to, and that WTO allows countries to do whatever they want, the country that brought the complaint then can get compensation in some other way. And so typically that means lowering tariffs on other items or other things like that. The problem with the WTO judicial system right now is because of the fact that the U.S. starting in I think you mentioned in your slide, Barry, actually during the Obama administration, started to withhold approval of new appellate body members coming on to the appellate body. There's 7 members. There's 3 will rule on a given case. They have fixed terms and then they rotate off. And what's happened is that all the appellate bodies have rotated off, and the U.S. continues, many years later, still not approving new members. So the appellate body is essentially moribund. If you don't like the ruling, you can appeal it, but it will go into a void and nothing happens. And so that's unfortunately the teeth of the judicial system there, the dispute settlement system, which worked very, very well, not to everyone's liking, but for example, the cases the U.S. took in agriculture, we won about 85% of those, and saw some changes in programs that enacted by virtue of that. But
can I just ask a question here? So do you have any sense of whether the Biden administration is moving to resolving the appellate issue?
No. The appellate body meets, or the dispute settlement body meets every month, and every month a slate of candidates is put forward, and every month the U.S. declines to support it. So no, apparently there are talks behind the scenes, that's what I've been told, but on surface, no progress.
But let's come back to that original question. The WTO 19.1 limit, say in the AMS, is not at all suitable for a dispute settlement because there's no there. That's a calculation. It's an ex post calculation. It's not an ongoing program. I've been involved in a bunch of WTO disputes working for different countries, and nobody could possibly bring that case because by the time they brought the case, well, it's a new year, and the U.S. should say, well, that's a new year, we'll see. So it's not the result of a specific policy, it's a result of a policy plus a bunch of world market conditions. So I don't see anybody bringing cases.
They have. But it's
successfully, let me say.
Yeah, they were suspended. You're right.
They just don't get anywhere.
Yeah.
Whereas very specific things, the U.S. had a law on country of origin labeling. Canada disputed that at the WTO. Took a few years. The U.S. appealed a few times. This is before the appellate body died, and the U.S. lost and changed the law. Obama signed the law a little before Christmas, and it's dead. And those kind of successful things happened. And maybe because there were a few that didn't favor the U.S., as Joe says, not very many, mostly the U.S. would win. The U.S. has abandoned the WTO, which is odd in the sense because the dispute settlement system at the WTO was modeled after the U.S. court system.
Yeah, it's not
And
the
this
ag
is like
cases
having
either.
a U.S. court system without an appellate, with no Supreme Court and no appeals courts. And as Joe says, you can win, and then naturally, if people lose, they appeal. They think maybe they'll do better at the appellate. And if there's no appellate, it's dead. And I blame it's really a combination of left and right here that has sort of, for perhaps different reasons, or maybe the same reason, just anti-trade, have let the judicial part of the WTO fade away. And it sort of faded away as members dropped out one by one.
Dan, you mentioned in your talk about energy policy maybe having an impact on dairies, but I just wanted to open it up, I guess, to maybe a bigger question, because it seems like climate smart production is kind of on the minds of a lot of the ag committees. And do you see any interaction with the Title I policies and what we would kind of see as climate smart agriculture going forward?
I'll say two quick things, and then other people who follow Midwest agriculture more than I do. We've done a lot of this in California, by the way, for lots of different crops. Spend bundles and bundles of money with very good intentions and no evidence of a climate result. But nationally, I see it more a matter of mission creep on the part of growers who say, gee, maybe we won't have as much political support we've had for the last 90 years for our traditional farm programs, so maybe we ought to transition. Same payments would go to the same farms, just labeled as climate. The interaction with energy policy generally, when it's not specifically climate, is really an ethanol question. And there I think I'll leave it to these ethanol specialists to tell us about that.
Biofuels
generally, yeah, that's right.
Biodiesel is probably even more effective.
Exactly. And I do think that has a lot to do with commodity prices where they are, land prices, Barry, in the Midwest land prices anyway, and high costs of feed to the livestock industry, which raises those costs. So it's in the middle of all of this. And one could argue why you need a corn program if you have or for that matter, a soybean program if you've got biodiesel and ethanol.
Yeah, it's interesting to contrast the two in one sense. Ethanol had this big buildup out of 2005, 2011 or so, going to 15 billion gallon capacity. And of course, was a big component in the increase in corn prices and arguably other prices during the mid-2000s. And at the time, I was over at the Department of Agriculture, and we certainly had a lot of livestock guys coming in complaining because corn prices were going through the roof and everything. What's interesting about biodiesel is, right now, probably, I suspect most of you don't know that 46% of soybean oil produced in this country or consumed in this country goes to biodiesel. 46%.
That's a lot.
And it's a lot. You get less complaints from the livestock side. Why? Because soybeans are crushed, and out of that comes some oil that may be going to biodiesel, but a lot of protein meal, soybean meal. And because of that, they are...
Is that because we're all using olive oil now? Because I work with a California olive ranch a lot. They'll be very happy to know that we've priced soybean oil out of the
soybean oil
market.
has gone through the roof. Yeah, I mean, vegetable oils in general have gone through the roof. I mean, it's been exacerbated by certainly even events like Ukraine, where you're talking 15% of vegetable oil is sun, and 50% of sunflower oil exported in the world comes out of Ukraine. So all those things have had some impact the past few years. But in the U.S. isn't alone. I mean, you have palm oil.
Are we importing a lot more vegetable oil?
And farm bill, and I'm talking palm oil in Indonesia. but palm oil is 55-60% of the vegetable oil market worldwide.
Right.
Indonesia is half that, or if not more, 55% or so. So roughly a third of what is traded in the world in terms of vegetable oil is palm. They have a 35% blending mandate right now for biodiesel. And last year, when prices were going through the roof, what did they do? They put an export ban, a hard export ban on palm oil exports. Why? At a time when they were putting more into their domestic fuel supply than they were into their domestic
They
feeding
also
program
make,
for 3 weeks. And then their producers said, hey, you're killing us, because of course their prices plummeted and it got back. But it's just to say these programs are all very, very mixed, and it has nothing to do with the Farm Bill, so I apologize.
Well, let's step back a minute though, because the price of soybeans has been running at what, about $14 a bushel since what, late 2021 maybe.
Right. I mean, you've seen
a lot of that
price
has
down.
been driven by U.S. domestic policy, meaning ethanol policy.
Well, a lot of biodiesel policy, and you also had a big drought in Brazil. So there are a lot of market factors at work here. These aren't just strictly market.
But here's the link to the Farm Bill. If soybeans are selling for $14 and effectively the intervention price under the PLC and ARC is at something like $8.10 a bushel, that's one of the stories why the soybean guys are saying this isn't fair.
All right, so
It's not fair.
with that, we're going to stop, and I just want to thank the American Enterprise Institute for hosting us. Thank all of our speakers for being here, and thank our audience, and for those of you online. Thank you very much.
Sorry.
It's our fault.